To us, I Dream of Jeannie was the ultimate mid-60s fantasy. It was bright, it was magical, and it had Barbara Eden's iconic laugh. But if you look past the colorful costumes and the slapstick comedy, there's a different story. A story about a cast that was struggling with addiction, a production that was constantly at war with censors, and a leading man who felt like he was drowning in a role he couldn't escape. We loved Jeannie because she could solve any problem with a blink of her eyes. But as we're about to find out, the real problems on the set of I Dream of Jeannie couldn't be blinked away. Let's take a look. 15. The spirit of Jim Beam, the $5 myth. When we think of Jeannie's bottle, we think of a priceless artifact, something unearthed from a sultan's tomb. But the true story of its origin is a perfect metaphor for the smoke and mirrors of Hollywood. In the high-pressure weeks leading up to the pilot, the art department was panicking. They needed something that looked mystical, but also fit the sleek, mid-century aesthetic of a bachelor's home. They searched high-end antique shops and prop houses, finding nothing. Then a production designer walked into a local liquor store in North Hollywood. There, on a dusty bottom shelf, sat a 1964 Christmas edition decanter for Jim Beam whiskey. It was cheap. It was mass-produced. It was essentially trash. But the designer saw the curves, the sleek neck, and the potential. They bought it for about $5, drained the whiskey, and handed it to a painter. But here's where the tragedy of the prop begins. Because the bottle was made of thin, cheap glass, it was incredibly fragile. The heat from the studio lights would cause the gold and purple leaf paint to flake and bubble. Throughout the show's 5-year run, they had to create dozens of these priceless bottles. Each one was a reminder that the magic was just a coat of paint over a bottle of booze. In the first season, filmed in black and white, the bottle was painted a dark, sickly green, so it would look heavy and metallic on the grayscale film. Barbara Eden once recalled the irony of it. The most magical object in the world felt like a sticky, dirty piece of garbage in her hands. It was the first of many illusions that the cast had to maintain, a symbol of wonder built on a foundation of the mundane. 14. The Navel War. The anatomy of censorship. Imagine for a second being Barbara Eden. You are the star of a hit show. You are a classically trained actress. And yet for 5 years, the most powerful men in television are obsessed with one single square inch of your body, your belly button. The Navel War of I Dream of Jeannie sounds like a joke today, but in 1965 it was a battle of psychological warfare. The NBC Standards and Practices Department, the censors, were terrified. They believed that if Jeannie's navel was shown, it would suggest she was too human, or worse, too sexual. The producers received weekly memos detailing exactly how high Barbara's harem pants had to be. Designers were forced to sew skin-colored fabric into the waistband. They used spirit gum and surgical tape to keep the silk from slipping even a fraction of an inch during Jeannie's dances. But what was the cost? Barbara Eden had to spend 14 hours a day encased in a costume that was literally taped to her skin. She couldn't breathe properly, she couldn't eat a full meal because the bloating would push the waistband down, and she was constantly under the scrutiny of men with clipboards checking her midriff. It was a humiliating, dehumanizing experience. The forbidden nature of her navel turned her body into a battlefield for the era's bizarre moral double standards. They were fine with her being a slave who called a man master, but the sight of a belly button. That was where they drew the line. 13. Larry Hagman's Liquid Lunch. The pressure of the straight man. Larry Hagman is remembered today as a legend, but in 1965 he was a man drowning in a role he despised. As the son of Broadway legend Mary Martin Larry had high artistic ambitions, he wanted to be a serious actor. Instead, he found himself playing the straight man to a magical Jeannie. Every day on set, Larry felt the weight of the reaction shot. While Barbara got to blink and do magic, Larry had to look confused, frustrated, or shocked. It was repetitive, soul-crushing work for a man of his talent. To cope with the boredom and the feeling of being trapped in a lowbrow sitcom, Larry began to bring a liquid lunch to the set. He would disappear into his trailer and drink champagne or bourbon, returning to the set in a state that crew members described as unpredictable. There were days when he would show up in a full suit but refuse to speak his lines. There were days when he would physically protest the scripts, which he found idiotic. Barbara Eden often had to act as his protector, whispering his lines to him or calming him down when he went into a rage against the directors. The tragedy here is the invisible struggle of a man who felt his talent was being wasted. He was Tony Nelson, the hero, the astronaut. But inside, Larry Hagman was a captive using alcohol to numb the pain of a career he felt was going nowhere. When you see Tony Nelson's jaw tighten on screen, that's not just acting. That's a man holding back a scream. 12. The Bewitched Shadow. The Copycat Curse. In the television industry, there is a saying, "Success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan." When I Dream of Jeannie premiered, it was immediately branded as a failure of imagination, a cheap copy of ABC's Bewitched. The rivalry wasn't just in the ratings, it was in the very soul of the production. The Jeannie team felt like they were constantly living in the shadow of Samantha Stevens. They were forced to use the same guest stars, the same directors, and even the same filming locations on the Columbia Ranch. If you look closely at the neighborhood in Jeannie, you are looking at the exact same streets used in Bewitched. This created a toxic atmosphere of comparison. The actors felt like second-class citizens. Larry Hagman was constantly compared to Dick York, and Barbara Eden was compared to Elizabeth Montgomery. But the irony, the aha moment, is that while Bewitched was about a woman trying to fit into society, Jeannie was accidentally about a woman who destroyed society. Jeannie was chaotic. She was unfiltered. She was the other. The tragedy was that the critics couldn't see the subversive brilliance of the show because they were too busy looking for a carbon copy. The cast had to work twice as hard to prove they weren't just a bottle version of a witch. It was a creative prison that defined the first 2 years of the show, a feeling of being a number two that haunted the production until the very end. 11. The Silk Veil of Pregnancy, a Hidden Life. Perhaps the most impressive feat of magic ever performed on the show happened in Season 1. But it wasn't done by Jeannie, it was done by the cinematographers. When the show was finally greenlit, Barbara Eden discovered she was pregnant. For a 1965 sitcom starring a woman in a bikini-style outfit, this was a catastrophe. The network wanted to fire her. They wanted to start over. But the creator Sidney Sheldon refused. He knew Barbara was the soul of the show. So they performed a visual vanishing act. For the first 10 episodes, Barbara Eden was filmed through layers of literal silk. They added veils upon veils to her costume to hide her growing midsection. Directors were ordered to only film her from the chest up, or to have her stand behind large pieces of furniture. Imagine the physical toll. Barbara was dealing with morning sickness, the exhaustion of the first trimester, and the immense heat of the studio, all while draped in yards of heavy, non-breathable fabric. She was carrying a new life, while pretending to be an immortal being who didn't even have a navel. The tragic irony. The audience never knew. They saw a glowing, ethereal goddess. They didn't see the woman who was ready to collapse between, takes the mother who was terrified that her career would end before it truly began. It was a secret kept with military precision, a reminder that in Hollywood, the reality of being a woman, of aging, of mothering, of being human, must always be hidden behind a veil of fantasy. 10. The Lion's Breath Survival on Stage 4. Background music. The sound of a low, guttural animal growl fades in, accompanied by a tense, rhythmic drum beat. Visuals show high-contrast, grainy footage of a lion's eyes. In the mid-1960s, Hollywood had a dangerous obsession with realism. Long before the era of safe digital CGI, if a script called for a lion, the producers didn't hire an animator, they hired a trainer and a 500-pound predator. In one of the most famous episodes of I Dream of Jeannie, Tony Nelson's living room is transformed into a literal den for a massive lion named Major. But here's the thing, behind the laughter of the live studio audience, there was raw, cold-blooded fear. Imagine being Larry Hagman. You're already struggling with the pressure of the show, and now you're told to share a cramped hot set with a beast that could end your life in a single swipe. Larry was terrified. He wasn't just acting scared. He was visibly shaking his skin pale under the heavy studio lights. He knew that the smell of his own fear could trigger an attack. Then something changed. Barbara Eden walked onto the set. While the men in the crew were backing away, Barbara, the ethereal Jeannie, walked right up to the lion. She had been told by the trainer to establish dominance through calm. She stood perfectly still, letting the 500-pound beast sniff her neck. Can you even picture that? The purr of the lion was so loud it was picked up by the microphones vibrating through Barbara's chest. For a moment, the set was silent. It was a standoff between a Hollywood star and the king of the jungle. Barbara's bravery saved the shoot, but it left a lasting trauma on Larry Hagman. He realized that day that the studio cared more about a gag than his life. It was a turning point in his relationship with the producers, a moment where the magic of television felt like a death trap. The great palette shift. The $400,000 T-Bull. If you watch the first season of I Dream of Jeannie today, there is a haunting cinematic quality to it. The shadows are deeper, the desert island feels more isolated, and the mystery of the bottle feels real. That's because it was filmed in glorious black and white. But this wasn't a creative choice. It was a budget war. NBC executives were convinced that the show would be a one-hit wonder. They refused to spend the extra $400,000, a massive sum in 1965, to film in color. They thought the show was too silly to deserve the investment. But then the ratings hit. America fell in love with the girl in the bottle, and suddenly the network was scrambling. The transition to color in Season 2 was a cultural earthquake for the show. But it came at a price. In the black and white era, the special effects, the smoke, the disappearances, the flying objects looked seamless. The shadows hid the wires. The grayscale gave the magic a sense of weight. But in color, everything looked like a toy. The pink of Jeannie's costume became so bright, it was almost neon, distracting from Barbara's performance. The magic began to look like a cartoon. Sidney Sheldon, the show's creator, lamented this shift until the day he died. He felt that color stripped away the show's soul, turning a mystical fantasy into a plastic sitcom. It was the first step toward the show's eventual decline, a reminder that, in Hollywood, more is often less, and the brightest colors often hide the shallowest stories. 8. The death of mystery. The marriage death knell. There is a term in television history called jumping the shark, but for I Dream of Jeannie, we should call it the wedding bell curse. For 5 seasons, the entire show was built on a single agonizing question: will they or won't they? The sexual tension between a master and his Jeannie was the engine that kept millions of people tuned in every week. It was a dangerous, flirtatious dance that broke the rules of 1960s morality. But then the corporate suits interfered. Under pressure from the network to normalize the show for a changing audience, the producers decided to have Tony and Jeannie get married. Larry Hagman was furious. He knew with a veteran actor's instinct that this was the end. He told the writers, once they're married, the magic is gone. There's no more story to tell. He was right. The wedding episode was one of the most watched events of the decade. But the moment the I do's were spoken, the ratings began to evaporate. The mystery was solved. The fantasy was grounded. The Jeannie was no longer a mystical force of nature. She was a housewife. The tragedy wasn't just in the cancellation that followed, it was in the hollow feeling on set. The actors felt they were playing a different show entirely. The sparkle in Barbara's eyes dimmed, and Larry's frustration reached a boiling point. They had won the battle for happily ever after, but they had lost the war for the audience's imagination. It remains one of the greatest creative blunders in TV history, a lesson that some bottles are never meant to be fully opened. 7. Bill Daly's Mask. The dyslexic genius. Every great comedy needs a Roger Healy, the loyal, slightly dim-witted best friend who provides the relief when the drama gets too heavy. Bill Daly played that role with a perfection that made it look easy. But behind the goofy grin and the impeccable timing, Bill was fighting a battle that none of his fans knew about. Bill Daly was severely dyslexic. In the 1960s, this wasn't seen as a learning difference. It was often mislabeled as a lack of intelligence. Bill couldn't read the scripts. He couldn't look at a page of dialogue and memorize it like Barbara or Larry could. Can you imagine the terror of that? Every day walking onto a high-stakes set, where every minute costs thousands of dollars knowing that you can't read the words you're supposed to say. Bill had to develop a survival system. He would have his wife or a friend read the scripts to him over and over again until he had the sound of the words memorized. He relied entirely on his ears and his instincts. Because he couldn't rely on the written word, he became a master of physical comedy and the pause. Those legendary Roger Healy reactions weren't just scripted jokes. They were a man navigating a world he couldn't read. On top of this, Bill was dealing with profound personal loss during the show's run, losing family members, and facing the fragility of his own career. He chose to be the funny man so that no one would see the struggle underneath. He was the anchor of the show, the man who made everyone feel safe, while he himself was walking on a tightrope every single day. 6. The Silk Prison. The physical toll of being a fantasy. To the world, Jeannie was light as air, a being of pure magic. But for Barbara Eden, being Jeannie was a grueling physical endurance test that lasted 14 hours a day. Let's talk about the costume. It wasn't just clothes, it was an engineered prison. Because the Naval War required the waistband to be so high, the costume was reinforced with stiff, unforgiving boning that cut into Barbara's ribs every time she breathed. The silk was delicate, but it was also a heat trap. Under the 110-degree studio lights, Barbara would be drenched in sweat within minutes, but she wasn't allowed to show a single drop. The production crew would have to use air compressors to blow cold air under her veils between takes just to keep her from fainting. Imagine the sensory overload, the smell of the chemical smoke used for her disappearances, the blinding glare of the lights, and the constant itching irritation of the spirit gum used to tape her costume to her body. But there was a psychological toll, too. Because she was so recognizable in that pink outfit, she could never leave the character. Even in her dressing room, she was Jeannie. Fans would break into the studio just to catch a glimpse of the Jeannie. She became an object, a piece of studio property, a fantasy that belonged to everyone but herself. She once said that the happiest part of her day was the hour it took to scrub the heavy makeup and the adhesive off her skin at night. It was the only time she felt like Barbara again. The pink smoke was beautiful to us, but for her, it was a cloud of exhaustion that she had to smile through for 5 long years. The NASA Cold Shoulder. A war between science and sorcery. Imagine it's July 1969. The entire world is holding its breath, eyes glued to black and white television sets as Neil Armstrong takes that one small step. At that moment, NASA was the pinnacle of human achievement, cold, calculated, and serious. Now imagine being a top-tier rocket scientist and turning on the TV to see Captain Tony Nelson, a supposed NASA astronaut, being turned into a dog, or having his house filled with pink smoke by a blonde genie in a bottle. to NASA. I Dream of Jeannie wasn't a harmless comedy, it was a PR nightmare. Here's the thing, while the show did more to popularize the idea of being an astronaut than almost any news program, the real-life agency wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. They were terrified that the American public would stop taking the multi-billion-dollar space program seriously if they associated it with a slave and master dynamic involving magic. The producers repeatedly begged NASA for technical assistance, authentic footage of the Cocoa Beach launch sites, or even just permission to film near the hangars. NASA's response, a resounding, cold-blooded no. They viewed the show as frivolous and distracting. While the cast of Star Trek was being invited to NASA facilities, the Jeannie cast was kept at arm's length. This created a strange, lonely atmosphere on set. Larry Hagman felt the sting of this disapproval deeply. He wanted Tony Nelson to be a real hero, but he was playing a hero that the real heroes didn't want. Can you imagine the frustration? You're wearing the uniform, you're playing the part, but the people you're honoring think you're a joke. This friction between the rigid logic of the space age and the chaotic magic of the Jeannie world wasn't just on screen, it was a real-world cultural clash that haunted the production until its very last day. The Dark Mirror, Barbara Eden's psychological release as Jeannie II. For years, Barbara Eden had to be perfect. She had to be the bubbly, submissive, and infinitely loyal good Jeannie. She had to call a man master and blink her eyes to solve his every whim. It was a role that required an exhausting amount of perpetual sunshine. But every now and then, the writers would introduce her sister, Jeannie II. And here is where we find the real Barbara Eden. In a secret that few fans realized at the time, Barbara actually preferred playing the evil sister. Why? Because Jeannie, too, was everything the 1960s told women not to be. She was manipulative, she was selfish, she was loud, and she was fiercely independent. When Barbara put on that dark brunette wig and the striking green costume, she felt a surge of liberation. Imagine the psychological relief of finally being able to drop the master act. As Jeannie II, Barbara could be biting and sarcastic. She could treat Tony Nelson like a pawn rather than a god. It was her way of venting the immense pressure of being America's golden girl. Crew members noted that on the days Barbara played the sister, her energy changed. She was sharper, more intense. It was a dark mirror to the era's expectations of femininity. While good Jeannie was the dream of every 1960s man, Jeannie II was the reality of a woman who was tired of being kept in a bottle. This duality is what kept Barbara sane during the grueling 14-hour shoots, a hidden psychological valve that allowed her to survive the stifling perfection of her lead role. Say, the J.R. Ewing exorcism, Larry Hagman's fight for survival. When the lights finally went out on I Dream of Jeannie in 1970, Larry Hagman didn't walk away with a smile. He walked away into a professional graveyard. In Hollywood, there is no cage more restrictive than typecasting. For years, Larry couldn't walk into an audition without someone expecting him to trip over a rug or look confusedly at a bottle. He was Tony Nelson, the bumbling, nice, safe astronaut. Serious directors wouldn't touch him. He was a sitcom actor, a label that felt like a death sentence to his artistic soul. He spent the better part of the 1970s in a state of quiet desperation, doing guest spots on forgettable shows, feeling his talent wither in the shadow of the Jeannie. The tragedy was that his success had become his prison. But then, in 1978, a script came across his desk for a show called Dallas. The character was J.R. Ewing, a man who was the polar opposite of Tony Nelson. J.R. was cruel, greedy, and morally bankrupt. Larry Hagman took that role not just for the money, but for revenge. He used J.R. Ewing to kill Tony Nelson. He wanted to prove to the world that the nice guy they had laughed at for 5 years was capable of pure, unadulterated coldness. When he became the most hated man on television during the Who Shot J.R.R. craze, Larry finally felt free. He had exorcised the ghost of the bottle, but the cost was a decade of his life spent in a creative vacuum, a man who had to become a villain just to escape the master he had served for so long. 2. The 15-year void. When the magic stopped breathing. We want to believe that when our favorite TV stars finish a show, they go out for drinks and stay best friends forever. We want to believe the magic is real. But the reality of I Dream of Jeannie is much more somber. After the final episode wrapped, Larry Hagman and Barbara Eden essentially stopped speaking for 15 years. Can you imagine that? After 5 years of working 70-hour weeks, after sharing a lion in a living room, after the naval wars and the secret of pregnancies, they became strangers. The reason wasn't hatred, it was exhaustion. The set of I Dream of Jeannie had become a site of trauma for both of them. For Larry, it was the site of his drinking and his frustration. For Barbara, it was the site of her physical confinement and the stifling of her independence. The show was a golden bottle that they both needed to shatter. They didn't attend each other's parties. They didn't call on birthdays. They needed a decade and a half of silence to let the smoke finally settle. It wasn't until a reunion movie in the mid-1980s that they finally looked at each other not as Master and Jeannie, but as two aging humans who had survived a war. They finally made peace, but that 15-year void is a haunting reminder of the high price of nostalgia. Behind the laughter we heard on our speakers, there was a silence that lasted a generation. The Last Guardian, Barbara Eden and the Empty Bottle. As of today, Barbara Eden is the last one left. Think about the weight of that. Bill Daly, the hilarious Roger Healy, is gone. Hayden Rourke, the suspicious Dr. Bellows, is gone. And in 2012, her partner in the desert, Larry Hagman, passed away. Barbara Eden is now in her 90s, and she is the sole keeper of the flame. She still appears at conventions, still puts on a version of that pink costume, and still blinks for the fans. But there is a profound cosmic tragedy in her survival. She played a character who was immortal, a being who had seen 2,000 years of history and would see 2,000 more. But in real life, she is watching her world disappear. Every time she blinks for a photo today, she is blinking for a cast that isn't there. She is the last person on Earth who knows exactly how hot those lights were, how the Jim Beam bottle felt in her hand, and what Larry Hagman whispered to her when the cameras stopped rolling. She is a living monument to a dream that has ended. The tragedy of I Dream of Jeannie isn't in the secrets we've revealed today. It's in the fact that the magic has nowhere left to go but into the history books. Barbara Eden isn't just an actress anymore. She is the ghost of a decade that believed in magic, living in a world that has forgotten how to blink. So we come to the end of our journey. We've looked behind the veils, we've smelled the whiskey in the prop bottle, and we've felt the fear of the lion's breath. I Dream of Jeannie was never just a show about a girl in a bottle. It was a mirror held up to the 1960s, a time of space-age dreams and old-world prejudices of physical endurance and hidden addictions. We loved it because it promised us that with a single blink, all our problems could vanish. But as we've seen, the real magic wasn't in the special effects. The real magic was in the two humans, Barbara and Larry, who showed up every day despite the pain, despite the alcohol, and despite the censorship to give us a reason to smile. Maybe the final secret is this: we are all Tony Nelson stranded on a beach, looking for something to save us. And we are all Jeannie trapped in our own versions of a bottle, waiting for someone to let us out. Until next time, when you look at the stars, or when you see a dusty old bottle in an antique shop, remember to blink, because you never know what magic or what tragedy is waiting inside.